Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me, Loretta, Hugh, Ernesto, who I've not met, but I can see you there. Hi. I do need to make some amends and confess initially that I haven't really been up to speed for many years with the gentrification literature. And I started to think why that might be, and I'll come back to that toward the end of my 10-minute bit here about why that might be, because I think it's relevant for perhaps some of the things I want to say that are critical of the book, comradely critical, because I think it's a terrific book, it's a terrific project. It's a project I could never undertake, wonderful sort of detail, studies that have gone on, empirical research, and it's been so beautifully put together that I was very impressed with the book. So the project politically, we're right on. Theoretically, I was with it. So my criticisms are more political and theoretical, but I'll come back to that, and I'll come back to why I think that my lapses with the gentrification literature have been somewhat intentional. What surprised me a little bit is when I started to look at the book was how much these guys have been working on a similar project to what I've been thinking about over the past number of years, trying to develop some kind of theory of urbanization around planetary urbanization, using obviously the work of Henri Lefebvre and the questions of urban society and the coming complete urbanization of society that he talks about in the Urban Revolution. So it was very nice to see the way a lot of the things that I've been thinking about around planetary urbanization and some of the things that people like Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt and Anya Roy and Jenny Robinson have been thinking about over the past few years have been integrated into this notion of planetary gentrification. So thinking the way in which we know now, we have enough evidence and enough empirical data to know that what is going on in the world is a great fracking of space. The urban process is something like the progressive production of ever more frackable spatial units, that we can see how land is being fracked for value almost everywhere. So there is a generalization that can clearly be made about the kinds of processes that are happening globally around the urban process today. But clearly, urban studies would be very boring if it was just about making universalizations and generalizations without understanding the particularities of what's going on. So this idea of trying to find what Neil Smith a long while ago called plausible generalization is, I think, where we find a lot of common ground, knowing that there's a bigger, more planetary project going on here that isn't necessarily consciously done by forces, the ruling class forces writ large globally, but it does transpire as some kind of orthodoxy that we need to understand, I think, in its particularity and its nitty-gritty detail as it transpires, as it unfolds on the ground. So that, I think, is where we find a lot of common ground, a common theoretical ground, a common project to try and find a kind of particularity within the generality and a generality within the particularity. And what would that look like as a theory of urbanization today? And so how does planetary urbanization end up to become planetary gentrification? It's a fascinating project. So when I started to read the book and look at it, I was quite struck by why perhaps Loretta did want me to blurb it in the first place. So we're very much, I think, in the same choppy urban waters here, of trying to figure out what is going on for theoretical as well as political reasons. So there's a lot I can say that I agree with, and most of it I do agree with. But I figure that I just haven't really got time to go into a great deal of detail. But I just figure I perhaps flag out some points where I think that there may be some rethinking necessary. There'll be 3 points. I'd say stylistically, theoretically, and politically. I want to work around that. I think stylistically, I was very curious when Hume was talking about the writing project, because I think when you have a number of people writing a book, then there are some senses that some of the things do jar. So when I started to read the book, I did feel that the book could have been 50 pages shorter, if I have to be honest with you. And I say that by putting my independent scholar, non-academic writer's hat on. That I thought at times I was getting bogged down with what seemed often a bit of an extended literature review. I felt like I was having to go through a lot of the literature here that perhaps would be familiar to a lot of people. And it seemed like you had to feel like you had to say everything about everything. So I get that sense of coherency, and the argument taking place for me was just a little bit lacking. And I think that the need and the feeling perhaps that you wanted to say everything and cover every base. So you wanted to talk about the usual suspects, of which I consider myself probably one. But on the other hand, you wanted to placate the usual suspects. So there was a lot of, I think, quite academic point scoring going on. And for me, I just thought theoretically and politically, I didn't think you really had to do that. So I think stylistically, this book could have been a bit sharper, could have been a bit shorter, could have been edited a bit better, quite frankly, and it would have made it a book that could really have just danced off the page and enter into a theoretical and political world, which would have perhaps had a bit of a sharper edge. Theoretically, my second point of not criticism, but just prodding you a little bit to think about. And I raise this issue because this is an issue that's been raised about the gentrification, the planetary urbanization debate in general. And I think David hinted at it a little bit with that, what did you call it? Conceptual sprawl, I think was the word you used. And I think it's maybe within the notion of a conceptual sprawl, and this is something that has been aimed at people like Neil Brenner and Christian Smith. When you're starting to see the urban as planetary, the urban somehow now, in the old dichotomies between the urban and the rural, we're seeing the urban somehow overwhelm the rural. In the old dichotomy between the inner city and the suburb, we're seeing the urban somehow, in some way, conflate those two. The global north, the global south, we're seeing the urban somehow conflates that. So the old binaries are being conflated with a rather sprawly concept, which is being called the urban. And a lot of the questions that have been raised about that, and have been raised to me as well, is that, so just what is the specificity of the urban? If the urban's everywhere, if everything's urban, what do we have theoretically, conceptually, that is of any meaning in amongst a lot of conceptual sprawl? And then we see the problems of when one is forced to defend and actually define what one means by the urban. And anybody who reads Henri Lefebvre will know that actually he's rather slippery in the urban question about what he means by it. So I think that problem with the urban and the rather slippery, sprawly, sloppy nature of what it is as an it, even though we know it's a process and something much more variegated and multifarious than that, it does in some way resonate with the question of gentrification. If we've got slum gentrification in the global south, and we have mega projects, spectacular gentrification everywhere, if we have the gentrification going on through land grabbing, gentrification in the global north, we have gentrification almost everywhere. And gentrification seems to be this concept which mimics the urban. So if indeed we have gentrification is all of these things, then what is it? And I think that the problem a little bit resonates with the conclusions at the end of the book, when it said that at the end of the day, the question of political governance, and I'm quoting or paraphrasing, the question of political governance of the urban is the key issue. So there we've already slipped away into the realm of democracy, justice, equality, issues which in some way we can talk about without necessarily talking about gentrification. And I have to say that I rarely use the word gentrification anymore. I can't I'm not sure whether my book, Politics of the Encounter on Planetary Urbanization, actually uses the word gentrification. I'm not sure that the New Urban Question, another book I did recently, uses the word gentrification. So I'm thinking, am I losing something by not using it? Am I losing something theoretically? So there is a theoretical sloppiness, and it's a point that David made very well that I would want to reiterate. That leads on to the third aspect, and that would be the political ramifications. And perhaps why I've not really followed the gentrification literature over the years as closely as I should. I guess one of the reasons I haven't followed it is, you're going to hate me for saying this, it seems a little bit whinging and a bit boring. And I'm almost I kind of know that this is going on. It's a lot of bad news, which I know is happening. And so when I hear people talk about anti-gentrification, I know that I completely agree with them, and they are, my friends. In fact, some of my best friends study gentrification, as it were. Politically I align with it, but I just wonder whether there's a lot of energy, vehement energy, anger, and dissatisfaction being channeled into voicing and in some way organizing around a very defensive politics. A politics which in the end is quite conservative and defensive. The right to stay put. The right to stay put is something very different from the right to the city that Henri Lefebvre talks about. It's clear, of course, that the right to stay put is part of the right to the city. It's clear that we're talking, anybody on the left, anybody progressive, is going to be contesting a lot of the forces that we know are taking place now, particularly in cities. The questions of affordable housing somehow in some ways slip by. The defensive nature about gentrification has been something which has bothered me a lot. And I was quite happy to see Loretta and Hugh and Ernesto trying to link up the question of the right to the city with the right to stay put. But politically, what I would like to have seen done in this book, for me, was to say a lot more about the politics of anti-gentrification that somehow is about also what David Madden recently with Peter Marcuse called the radical right for some form of affordable housing, and to see maybe how the affirmative, more imaginative notions about how the struggles for democracy and for control, maybe even around state, as David points out, particularly in the local level, can somehow be linked up with a no, has to go with a yes. So the defensive nature of gentrification, I found over the years just somewhat obvious, somewhat boring. I know it goes on. I know it does. But is there anything else that can replace it, rather than just thinking about staying put? Staying put always seemed a bit odd to me anyway, somebody who's been completely nomadic for most of my adult life. I'm just thinking, isn't there another politics that can emerge from this? And I know that you, Loretta, have written and do engage in activism around these issues. But I just thought that this book might have been a better, would have been an occasion and perhaps the time to think about how that planetary gentrification issue can link up with some form of politics that could really be much more about the right to the city, the right to urban society, questions of how people can struggle for affordable housing, can think about a politics that isn't just about, in some way, denouncing, but is much more utopian and much more imaginative. And these things are going on as we speak, and you know more about this than I do. And I know that you've defended yourself by saying that this book wasn't about that, this was an analytical book. But I just thought that it would have been a nice occasion to talk more politically about some of the more radical aspects, rather than the more academic debates around gentrification that could have been voiced here. So that's just my little two penneth. Thank you.